won't spend a long time introducing George. He's been here before. Y'all know George, and he's a good friend. I've known him a few years, and he's a wonderful storyteller. And he's put that together in a book. And so it's a great little book. And so I'm pleased to have him here today, and I'll turn it over to George.
Thank you. Well, thank you for all y'all coming. And Ken, thank you very much for having me back again. And Carolyn Wilson, the retired librarian from Lipscomb, been a great supporter and helper of mine for a long time, and have a number of friends here and people I've seen at the archives at some of the gatherings. And so thank all of you for coming. I worked as a mental health, I'm a native Nashvilleian and lived here 77 years. And for the biggest part of my life, after my childhood, I was worked in mental health and did that for almost over 50 years, and then got into writing. I've written off and on all my life, but really took it on seriously, and it just had a second life with it, and I met great people like Paul Clements back here, and people all over Tennessee, and it's been a really, really rewarding to me to write. And I always have stories in my head, and every story I'm working on is the most favorite and best story I've ever written in my whole life. And so I really, really have enjoyed it. Today I'm going to talk about my third book. I had all of these things accumulated in my, a number of them I had written in rough drafts, and some of them more than rough drafts over the years. So I'd accumulated some things. I began as a poet, and the first thing I ever had published, it was published in Russia in the late 1960s. And I talked to my wife, because Atlantic Monthly turned me down at the same time for some poems. Talked to her about defecting, but she wouldn't go. So I've stayed on here and have enjoyed writing. So today, the jacket cover of this, and I'll tell you very quickly about this, is special. My wife died a little over 5 years ago in May, and we have a house. It was a family home in Estill Springs on Elk River. And after I had finished this, gathered enough material together, short stories and poetry in a journal that I kept in the 1960s in a very remote and wild part of Williams County. It's great. It's full of bootleggers, a lady of ill fame that lived in the hills, killers. I mean, and it's real. A lot of, some of this is made up, but it's all real. And so I put that in there, and I was trying to come up with a title, and I was exercising real early one morning, and I guess I was pumping blood to my head, and Come Sit With Me came to me as a title, and immediately I remembered this photograph that I made of my wife on the porch at Estill Springs, which is the last photograph ever made of her. And you can see through the screen, you can see Elk River, and you can see her dog, which I got for her when she first got her cancer. So it just turned into a beautiful, beautiful jacket. And the last story is also the title of the book is The Last Story, Come Sit With Me, which is a ghost story about myself and my wife. The first thing, I'm going to read two excerpts from, I'm going to read one full story, which is fairly short, and then read an excerpt from the second one. And I've selected those because they're really different, both in time and in mood and sort of, and you'll see as I read them how different they are. The first one is out of the first four stories in the book, fall under an umbrella title called Kids of Summer. And there are four stories in that about out of my childhood, which was spent over near David Lipscomb between Granny White Pike and Leland Lane. And so these five boys that I write about were myself and my four companions. And I'm going to read this first story, which is called Ride to Glory, but I'll read sort of the introduction to Kids of Summer. Summer was our heaven. We were inseparable. as we roamed the fields and woods of our neighborhood in downtown Nashville, our imaginations leading us into adventures, sometimes in the wrong direction, teaching us things of life and friendship which would guide our lives. The cast of characters: Billy Bob, 12, the oldest of our group, our heavily freckled leader, ruled over us with his fast fist. T.C., 11. When it came to creating disgusting deformities, he was the master with his eyelids turned inside out. Bush, 11, my best buddy, whose devout Catholic family, who drank all kinds of alcohol openly, saved me from many prejudices. Double M, 11, living all the way over on the next street. He was not quite a full member, but he had the best climbing trees and a barn. G.E., 10. I was the youngest, the chubbiest, and the quickest to come up with ideas for devilment. Ride to glory. Billy Bob was literally eaten up with freckles. In certain kinds of light, his skin looked like he had some gosh-awful tropical disease. 1,000 more, give or take a couple of hundred, and they would have all run together, turning him into one 5-foot-tall, skinny freckle. Then we'd have ended up calling him Nig because he'd have been permanently browned all over. Of course, calling him Nig would have made him fiercer than he was prone to be. For my sake, since Billy Bob was older and tougher than me, it's probably saved my life by his not being a total freckle. As I've already said, T.C. Bush and Double M made up the rest of our gang. Our acceptance of Double M, who lived on the next street, was helped considerably by his yard having an old barn that made a first-class clubhouse and a fort when we had BB battles with the Cullum gang, who lived on the other side of Leland Lane. Being Catholic, Double M and Bush ate a lot of fish. I've always felt that Fridays must have been hell on them. Maybe I shouldn't admit it, but I got a perverse pleasure when I ate cheeseburgers in front of them on Fridays, which I tried to do with regularity. Admit it, we all like having some solid here and now proof that we bet on the right horse when it comes to religion. Any kid will tell you that eating fish every Friday for the rest of your life is not even close to being in the race when it comes to cheeseburgers. It's a wonder they hung with it. If it had been me, I'd have joined another church just to eat the cheeseburgers. Back then, in the summertime, kids turned out ideas faster than those Old Testament types begat children. When you haven't got television or air conditioning and your mama is committed to teaching you the American work ethic, it tends to influence your creativeness in such things as getting out of the house without being seen. Those of us who made it gathered at the cussing tree. The cussing tree was a big old mock orange tree that grew green, bumpy, softball-sized mock oranges that dripped white sticky stuff when you used them as hand grenades. The tree was hidden in a place like Robin Hood might have had in Sherwood Forest. It's where we went to smoke and talk ugly. And it's where Billy Bob came up with the idea of turning our Red Ryder wagons into soapbox racers and riding them through a wall of fire. Democratic government wasn't Billy Bob's ambition when he was hot on some new and overpowering idea. At those times, his prepubescent squeak ruled over us like a Henry VIII bell, even when we questioned his judgment on things like walls of fire. By the time we finished the cigarettes that Bush had confiscated from his daddy and pumped ourselves up with some fresh dirty talk, we had Billy Bob's idea roughed out into a plan. I'm telling you, in those days, kids were whizzes when it came to creating. If we'd set our minds on better mousetraps, all of us would be rich today. Come the next day, we replaced the beds of our Red Riders with racing bodies made from wooden crates. Tied to the front wheel axle were guide ropes that turned them sharper than power steering. Needless to say, Billy Bob's horsepower, that is, he had built an extension on the back for one of us to kneel on while he pushed. His idea had come from a movie-toned film that showed a stuntman smashing his car through a burning barn, then leaping out with his hands clasped high above his head while the crowd roared. As he acted out the leaping, hand-clasping part, I saw a semi-wild, excited look on Billy Bob's face, which caused me to tense up. I'd seen it before, as I had a flashback to the previous winter when I fell through the ice into Miss Foy's goldfish pond. On that day, he had turned us all into Northwood trappers. And now here he was with that same crazy look, telling us about the glories of riding through a wall of fire. Double M's street was perfect for setting walls on fire. It had a steep hill, no traffic, and best of all, you couldn't see the bottom of the hill from anybody's house. It took a while for us to drag a pile of cardboard boxes all the way from the back of Landon's hardware store to Double M's street. Billy Bob supervised the wall building. After a lot of adjusting to meet his specifications, it was impressive looking. It was 4 feet deep, 8 feet high, and 12 feet wide. From a distance, it looked like it would stop a tank. By now, Billy Bob's movements were starting to get quick all over, like you do when you've just got to take a leak and your surroundings won't allow it. To tell the truth, I was picking up speed too. My muscles were getting jerky and my vision sharper. Now I was seeing the beauty of it all. That great wall of roaring red, yellow, and white flames rising to heaven, and me and Billy Bob riding through it to safety on the other side, where the cheers of the crowds were waiting for us to leap out with our hands clasped high in the air as heroes. No one was going to push Billy Bob's racer but me. For today we were bound for glory. We waited at the top of the hill, he forward in the driver's seat, legs squeezed down inside the wooden body, knuckles white from gripping the guide ropes, and me kneeling on the back, 1 foot on the ground, one leg bent like a taut bowstring, waiting to shoot toward our target. We waited, our eyes fixed on Bush, lighter of the flame. He lit his newspaper torch and carefully laid the fire around the base of the wall. His movements, the first wisp of flame and smoke, all seemed unreal, slow, silent, sinister, like some ancient preparation for sacrifice. All sound was suspended as I listened for the command. I waited, and then it came. Go! Muscles, bone, nerves, blood, flesh, all that was me, released in one mighty heave with such force that for an instant the racer's front wheels lifted off the ground, and then we rocketed down the hill, traveling at a velocity heretofore unknown by a Red Rider. Our racer sped down, 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 with wheels and wind whirling, as though we must lift from the earth into flight. We were a flash of light rushing toward Billy Bob's fiery vision, which zoomed upward to strike us. Suddenly, for a final split second, before my face, there was a roaring, burning, smothering wall of flame. My last thought was a flash image of a black, burned to a crisp chicken liver, me. And then we hit, and we're inside all the fire God ever made. Air, air, cool, cool air, free of air, clean of smoke, quiet, sweet tasting. I was out on the other side, safe and uncharred. I could hear a great mass cheering from the wonder-struck crowds, and through it all, someone screaming my name. It was Billy Bob. He was on fire. From the top of the wall, a single small box had fallen flaming into his lap. He was trapped in the racer and screaming something awful. "Get it off! Get it off! Get it off! Get it off!" With his attention seriously diverted, the racer zigzagged down the street, gave into a spin, jumped a ditch, and overturned. Dust, wisp of smoke, black flakes, and terrible language rose and spread around the wreckage. I had been thrown clear. T.C., Bush, and Double M rushed to the racer and dragged Billy Bob out and began rolling him in the dirt. I crawled over toward them and slowly climbed up my legs onto my feet. We helped him stand and began to do our best to separate the dirt and gravel and black bits of charred cardboard from his flesh. He seemed to be totally unappreciative for our efforts. For between groans and whimpers, he had flailed one of us, then another with the worst cussing I'd ever heard. But we stuck steadily to our task. We all knew there would be hell to pay if Billy Bob went home, and his mama looked at him, and he didn't look right. For all of our mamas were sworn to some unwritten but binding maternal act of perversity to telephone each other whenever they knew, or even suspicion, that we were up to no good. For they knew us. They knew that we had a righteous obligation to share with one another the joys of our sins. All in all, Billy Bob began looking better, especially after we had spit on our hands and cleaned his face. Double M kept brushing hard with some leaves on a big black spot on his t-shirt until he was rudely pushed away. We stood back to observe our handiwork. Everyone had hope on his face, especially Billy Bob. Like an artist seeking the slightest flaw on a finished portrait, we looked him up and down. Nobody moved or spoke. The very silence suggested something dreadful. I looked at T.C., then Double M, and Bush. Their eyes were stretched big wide, and the skin on their faces had gone white, loose, and scary. I got a sudden queasy, sick feeling, like a knife was twisting in the pit of my stomach. I looked again at Billy Bob, and there before me was the awful truth of our fiery ride. Billy Bob's eyebrows were burned plumb off his face. So that's one of these little boys. And all four of the stories have different qualities of our summers together. And the playoff, there's a lot of the playoff. There's a lot of seriousness of even morals that are learned by our experiences together. While they're written in humor, there's also the play of a boy growing up, going to a Church of Christ school as I did, and these other boys going to a Catholic school, and the differences in the way we sort of looked at life, and yet how this one Catholic family, the Millers, and that's in another story I started to read from, but it's a longer story, how they literally, because they were such good people, saved me from prejudice. And that's woven into this hilarious story called A Sword in the Attic. But I won't get off on that. Maybe we'll get together another time and I'll read that one. I want to shift gears now to something, as I said, that's entirely of a different mood and of a different time. As I write, I've noticed since I've written so much over the last few years that I will write through a series of things that are lighthearted and that make me smile, and I even laugh at my own writing. I sometimes read things back and I think, Lord goodness, that's funny, isn't it? And I just sit there and laugh like a fool. and there's nobody in the house but me, but that's okay. And then I'll shift gears and go to something that is darker and serious, and this one is one of that has more darkness to it. It's called Lucy Taggart's 6 Letters. I'm just going to read you the first pages of this because it's a long story and we won't have time to read the whole thing. It begins with a quotation from Aristotle. Those who love in excess also hate in excess. My Lord, Lucy Gaunt Taggart was a stunningly beautiful woman. Every small bit of her body, every small bit of her mind and soul, and all of her spirit was a woman's second to none, and certainly second to no man. Her long, straight neck was crowned by a finely shaped head with a face so strong and striking that men and even women could not help but stare at her. Her head was always held high, with her slightly curly, soft gray hair drawn tightly back in a bun. Her face toned with pride, her eyes ash-colored, intelligent, reserved, almost cold, seldom blinked as they saw the lies and fears beneath the mask of others. Her lips, full and pink, pursed slightly, as might a young woman who was about to kiss her lover. She was 63. Her beauty was sensual, not like that of a rose or a sunset. It was the beauty of the bed. Her flesh, touched with light and shadows, spread over her body like smooth white milk. Men sought her, but she never once did seek them. Many men, including even her minister, Reverend Thomas Dark of the Estill Springs Baptist Church, could barely control the lust in their faces or voices when they were near her. She treated these men, even if they were among the gentry, with the same coldness she might use when dealing with ill-mannered white trash. When she saw sex in the eyes of Reverend Dark the day he came to her house to comfort and pray with her after Bob's death, she told him to take his Bible and hat and go home and go to bed with his own wife. And after that, she never set foot in church again. Men saw her beauty, her aloofness, her perseverance. What they did not see was her anger, an anger that eventually turned into hatred when death came to her home. In Franklin County, the Gaunts were first among first. Raised in wealth and privilege with books, music, art, fine clothes, and love of family, Lucy believed, as her parents and ministers had taught her to believe, that the Bible was the literal Word of God and made it absolutely clear that white people were to rule the world and Negroes were to be their servants, their workers in the field, and the cleaners of their chamber pots. The only man she had ever loved was Robert Taggart, her handsome husband and successful owner of Jerusalem, a 1,000-acre plantation that spread along both sides of Elk River near the village of Estill Springs. He was a good husband and a loving father to their sons, Bob, Sam, Hubert, and their daughter Emma. Then war came. In the late morning of April 27, 1861, Robert and Bob rode into Winchester and enlisted in the 1st Tennessee. A week later, after making love that last night before he and Bob were to leave, Robert held Lucy close and promised, "I swear to you, and I swear to God, I'll keep Bob safe. It'll be over in no time. I won't let anything happen to him. I swear it." And at sunrise, when he and Bob were both mounted, he leaned from the saddle, gave her one last kiss, and they galloped down the lane. The last she saw of them was the waving of their hats, and they were gone. In the bitter years ahead, Lucy was borne up by her unyielding will and unfaltering faith that God would assure the South prevailed and that Robert and Bob would return safely. Her determination far exceeded Robert's, exceeding even that of her proud and powerful brother, John Gaunt, who led Confederate bushwhackers during the war and afterward became High Sheriff of Franklin County and Grand Titan of the Ku Klux Klan. On a stifling hot morning at Kennesaw Mountain, Georgia, June 27, 1864, a solid round shot fired from a Federal battery tore Lucy's and Robert's lives apart as it ripped away most of the lower part of Robert's left arm and then passed on through Bob's head, killing him instantly. More skeleton than man, Robert rode beside the wagon that carried Bob's coffin. He rode on Bob's mare, Lady, the reins gripped in his right hand, his left sleeve pinned to the shoulder. And so it was in September that when Robert, himself dead inside with guilt, returned home without an arm, he turned away from Lucy, who needed him, and turned rather into himself and to alcohol, giving her no comfort, showing her no love, much less being a comfort to their twin sons and daughter. Feeling sorrow only for himself, he blamed himself for being alive instead of Bob, whom he had loved maybe even more than he had Lucy. Robert returned to a wife who, though she had yearned for him at night for 3 long years, had not given way to despair, nor to men who sought her, nor to prayer or God. She had not had time for any of them. Every day from dawn to dusk, she worked alongside her sons and daughter and the Negroes in the fields, plowing, planting, chopping, and when the Yankees came and freed the Negroes, she worked all the harder with those few who stayed. Day after day, the sun turning her black, until from a distance she was one more Negro. She drove them all, the Negroes, her sons, her daughter, herself, harder than any slave driver had ever driven any slave at Jerusalem. And after all that longing, after all that giving up of who she once had been, after making herself into an animal so that he, Robert, and their remaining children, and she could have something that remained from all that once had been, though nothing could ever be again as it had been, for Bob would never be there with them again. Still, after all of that, she had not been dragged down into nothingness. How can a man fully know the pain of a woman who has lost a child to death? She has felt her child move inside her. Her eyes have looked down into her baby's as he suckled. And she has felt his arms around her neck and heard him first say, "Mama." And then years later, learns her child, now a man, has been killed in battle far from home. How can that pain ever fully leave her, knowing she will never see him again, never kiss his cheek? No man, not even a father, can know this pain. So that's the two, and I'm leaving you in sort of a heavy thing here. I sort of sense a heaviness suddenly in the room. So I will read you one poem that we will pick you up and raise you up. And this is based on I used to work I worked in Columbia, Tennessee for a long, long time, 28 years maybe, at the mental health center there. And the Elks Club, I passed it every morning. And I came into town one morning, and there were 3 old men sitting on the front of the Elks Club porch in rocking chairs. And I thought, man, if there's ever, the Lord's ever sent me a poem, He sent me those 3 guys right there. As soon as I got to center, I got a legal pad out and got a pencil and wrote that down real quick and wrote a few things, and this is what came from it. 3 old men on the Elks Club porch. 3 old men on the Elks Club porch rock on a summer's day. The sun is hot but cannot scorch their daily rock away. They rock forever and anon through days of long ago, an ancient rocking marathon. Their tails rock to and fro. Joe Bob decries the youth today. What are they coming to? It's drugs and no respect, I say. We need to hang a few. It's more hell and fire and brimstone the preachers need to preach, and leave that socialism alone, which all the young ones teach. Remember that old Camelite? He made you feel the heat. Hell, I once wet my bed in fright, and I had to hide the sheet. Just then, a funeral goes by. Their rockers cease to rock in honor of old friends who died. 12 strikes the courthouse clock. Well, Squire, they're burying Miss Irma, old Sam says kind of slow. And Squire, who likes English humor, winks. Yes, she's dead, you know. So with that, I will stop reading, and if you have any questions or things you'd like to ask me, I'll be glad to answer. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I just have a statement.
Yeah.
Maybe we can do it. When you told the first story, it's so sad today the kids are not out doing what you did. And I worry what they're going to be like when they're adults, how they're going to be able to interact and solve their own problems, because they are never without adult supervision anymore.
That's right. Well, there's a story in here, would you give an eye? And it goes, would you give an eye, ... And you have to read the story, what in the world does that title have to do? And it's about these same 5 little boys coming to town. And this is true. My dad would take us, he had a car lot down on Broad, and would bring us down there at this age in the morning at 8 or 8:30 o'clock, put us out. We all had enough change in our pocket to go to a movie or two and get some crystals. And we'd roam Nashville all day long. And it's a story of these 5 boys roaming Nashville and the things that we did. We'd go see the Mummy and just look at things that was floating in formaldehyde. We'd go play in the state capitol and play. And when Harvey's, we would have given him an award because we'd run up the escalators, went down and run down the one and play hide and seek in there and spend a whole day. Well, can you imagine 12 and 3 11 years old and 10-year-old boy spending the day in Nashville, and then in the afternoon we'd go down to my dad's car lot. And one day we were in an alleyway. We just roamed all over town. And behind a real fine women's store, there was some woven shoe baskets that had come in from Italy. And they just put them out there for the dump thing. And we looked at them and we thought, those are worth money. So we gathered and went out on the street and sold them. and sold them, made enough money to go back to Crystal's or to another movie or something. And so, yeah, you're quite right. And the fact, you know, and again, our imaginations, because these stories are just full of what went on inside this one little boy's head, you know, and how you would imagine yourself sometimes in a movie, in a film. You know, you were playing something, but you had seen a film that you thought, like Westerns, I love Westerns. One of my stories is where these little boys, this one, me, is imagining we're cowboys and we're capturing a wild horse. It was a pony, but and we did capture it, and we got reward money from it. We were always looking to make money. Yes?
You have great wordsmithing, and I wanted to ask, when did you first start your motivation to write?
Well, I grew up in a very interesting family. I had two, as I've always thought of them as two rivers. My mother's family, my grandfather was a Welshman born in 1864 in northern Wales. And he had a great influence on my life. He was a scholar and had books, and what books were left I got. And so that had, and he would tell me stories about, he was a sailor, he ran away from home as a little boy at 9 years old, went to Liverpool and sailed all his young life, and then finally came over and bought a farm in southern Kentucky, which is still in the family. But I would sit in his lap, and he would tell me stories about sailing around the Cape. It was before the Panama Canal, and you can imagine being a little boy with your grandfather and smelling, because he always had peppermint candy, smelling peppermint candy and his tobacco that he smoked for his pipe, and telling you those things. So storytelling, and then my other set of grandparents were hill people and whiskey makers and fox hunters, and some of them went to serve time in jail and for making whiskey, and just a wonderfully funny family and told. And so just these stories were just piling in, and we would tell them a lot. And then when I was a little bitty, when I was young, my mother was a reader. My sister's back here. Our mother was a reader. And I read, I went to the 5 and dime stores and got all the classic comics, and I had a huge collection and read classic comics, and then started reading, and then finally one day I started writing in the 60s, started writing poetry. And it was awful. I've still got it. I thought I was going to be James Dickey or Dylan Thomas. I wasn't quite sure which one, but one or the other. And so I aped them a lot. And then finally started hitting my own stride. And then just the poetry translated on into short stories. Yeah. Yes?
What's happened to the other 4?
Well, they're all in here. They all these first 4s. All the first. Well, let me see if I can find this real quick here. I tell about them. Oh, let me read this real quick. I was going to read this. This is another story, but this is about how prejudice is in your head as kids. I mean, it's just there. You get it, through there and all this stuff. A good example is what I knew about Catholics. This is a 10-year-old boy talking about what he knew about Catholics. They were condemned to eat fish every day, Friday for eternity. They baptized babies by sprinkling water on their heads instead of totally shoving them underwater. They had to sit in little closets and tell awful things about themselves. And then a priest they couldn't even see would give them a lot of boring stuff to do and say. They had to do what they were told by the Pope, who couldn't even speak good English, if at all, and wore a long robe instead of a suit and tie like grown preachers should. Also, he wanted to take over the United States. In school, the nuns beat hell out of the boys' knuckles and palms. They liked to drink and dance and gamble and have lots of children. When they died, they might have to hang around in a strange place for a long time before they ended up in heaven or hell. So, but at the end of this story, if I can find it here real quick, I'd take. As the years passed, we went our separate ways. The Millers moved away first, then T.C. and his family. After Billy Bob and Double M graduated from high school and went off to college, we might run into each other every year or so. We'd talk a few minutes and make promises to get together and bring each other up to date. We never did. I made new friends, as I'm sure they did. Slowly I forgot them. But then a few years back, when I started writing, they suddenly came into my mind. And I wrote a story about the five of us called Pony, followed by Ride to Glory. And now as I write The Sword in the Attic, I see us clearly again, half naked, sitting around our cussing tree, smoking and telling our newest dirty jokes, driving our soapbox racers through cardboard walls of fire, riding the lost pony that was the color of pure gold. I hear our laughter and damnations as we shoot one another on our backs, our bare backs with rubber guns. And for a little while, we're all together again. So we all went our different ways, and occasionally, as I said, I would run into one, and probably two or three of them are dead by now. But they're here. And this is relatively accurate to these boys. They were just great guys, really great. Yeah.
Have you ever considered writing any of the stories that you heard through your mental health years?
Yeah, well, Kim was talking to me about that earlier, about getting together, maybe recording it or something, because I had such a great life working in mental health, and just had the most wonderful, interesting experiences any human being could ever possibly have. Working out in a country area where there was no mental health at all, and you had nobody you could punt to. I mean, it was like a barroom brawl. You hit the problem with whatever you had, you know. And so I don't know, Kim, maybe we'll follow up with that someday and record it. And but my son-in-law has tried to get me to sit down and write those, but maybe I will.
I want to thank you for coming today. I want to thank George for being here, and he will be available for book signings after. And you need to write another book, George. Yeah. And so anyway, thank you for coming, and that concludes the First Tuesday. Thank you.